time when the AIDS Foundation was founded as the advocacy group around issues related to HIV. A couple of other organizations, Open Hand Chicago would have been the food service organization delivering meals. It became Vital Bridges, and it now falls under Heartland Alliance organizations. And then eventually TPAN came on the scene. As people started to live longer, there was a peer connectedness of helping people connect to each other. So really those early organizations, and the one, you know, obviously that I'm most connected to is Chicago House. And really, as the theme in the book starts coming up and it keeps developing around where do people go as they get sick and who takes care of them, it really was a pivotal time because so many people were getting sick. So many people, there was such great fear, similar to what we experience today around COVID-19. There was such fear around HIV that people were really struggling to find places to live. And then just economically, especially those who maybe didn't have money to fall back on or the resources or family, were oftentimes without income. And so had to find a place. So really the story goes, some leaders in the community gathered at the Baton Club and said, we need to do something. We have to find a way to house people. And thus, that's kind of how Chicago House was born. We ran hospices. We ran a hospice for probably the first several years of our existence. It was really the focus, taking care of people as they died. That is something that's still important. I think we lose sense of that. I think one of the most poignant stories of my time, my first time with Chicago House was about 4 or 5 years ago for about 8 years. And I remember we had put someone in a scattered site housing unit, and they'd been in the unit for about 2 or 3 weeks. And in that short time, they'd lived on the street for years. And in that 2 to 3 weeks time, they passed away. And what was amazing to me was the fact that Chicago House provides a place that's safe, not only to live and carry on your life, but also to die. And that's really deeply rooted in our organization. It's really where we come from in those years of hospice. And it's as important to have a place, a home to live as it is to die. And I think that's very important. And whatever kind of way someone's going, I think that's something that Chicago House treasures very much, making sure we give people a place to call home. And that's what we continue to do. I think things have changed. So as we grew as an organization, we went from just hospice work to more supportive housing. So providing staff as people transitioned and got healthier, got on medications. We created an independent living program where people could take care of themselves, but needed some case management and people looking after them. But we also then created a families program as HIV started to impact families. And back in the early 90s, opened our first program that served families and children as well. So we kind of kept adapting to the changes of HIV. We still maintain those housing facilities, but we also do a lot of scattered site housing now. We have hundreds of clients who live in their own apartments at different places in the city, and we continue to provide support for them. So those themes in the book, I think, continue to be very significant because oftentimes, even though a lot has changed from, I think of the difference between 1985 for myself, having a husband, a son who goes to a Catholic school, everyone knows we're gay, these gay dads, really different world, but a lot of the places where HIV still thrives, that is not true. It is still a secret, it's still not talked about. People are still kicked out of their homes. And so the work of Chicago House remains vital in populations in Chicago still to this day. So just some fascinating themes in the book and some of what Chicago House is about. So I'm going to step back. That's enough talking, but willing to engage or hear other questions.
So I was, Kelly, did you want to start? I had a couple of questions, but. No, go for it. I have some questions, and then we can open it up to see if anyone has any reflections based on what was just shared.
Yeah. So thank you. So there were a couple of themes that have come up for me, Michael, that perhaps you can touch on a little bit. First of all, and we touched on this in the previous 2 weeks as well, but perhaps if we can hear from an expert, the trajectory of the disease with respect to the populations that it is affecting, and and how, sort of organizations are pivoting to address that trajectory. And then the other question that I wanted to ask was more around Nora, who is leaving behind a substantial legacy to the university. If you can talk a little bit about legacy giving, and also, just generally fundraising in a time of where there are so many causes and there are so many areas in which, sort of like one could focus on giving, how that has changed, and how much legacy giving forms a part of fundraising, and what fundraising looks like for an organization like Chicago House.
I think just one quick thing on legacy giving in terms of the past. Really, I think Chicago House in particular, but other organizations like it, have really significantly benefited from individuals who lived through the AIDS crisis and came through it and were able to continue to be successful, but didn't have families. A lot has changed in the LGBTQ community. So back then people didn't have children typically. And so I think there was a lot of giving that happened for places like Chicago House, benefited from people that we might not even have known about, but when they died, they gave their estate to Chicago House or to an organization that meant a lot to them during that period of time. So I think that is a significant item. I think Chicago House continues to, in the early days, there was no money. There was very little government money. The only way Chicago House survived was on individuals and people stepping up to help the organization. Today, we're a lot more fortunate. Obviously, there is a lot of public support for the work we do, which is essentially important. But I think it's also important that we continue to cultivate individual support. I think that's really our roots. That's where we grew, and that's where we were able to take, to be able to care for people in the early years. And some of that's, I think, been lost a little bit, some of that connectedness. And I know that's a big commitment of the team at Chicago House to continue to connect to people around how important their support, both in terms of what they're able to bring to the organization as well as their financial support, is still vitally important to the work we do, letting us to extend our work and continue to do the things we need to do. So I think kind of that fundraising element, I want to make sure where I'm in the book, but you see some of that conflict building as someone chooses to give of their wealth when the family is saying, maybe that wealth should be coming to us. That conflict, I think that's something we hope people will keep in mind. As I have some of that, I'll be honest, my husband will kill me, hopefully he won't come in the room. But we have a battle internally. We have a young son who's 13. And obviously I've been in development and supporting nonprofits my whole life. And there's a part of me that says a big chunk of our money should not go to our son. It should go to organizations that have meant a lot to us and have been important to our community. And we shouldn't just give all our money to our son. So it's a new interesting dynamic, because in the past, our will was set up on all the charities, the LGBTQ charities that we support. And now with a son, that shifts. So how do you deal with that? So I think it's an interesting dynamic that's happening in our community as well, but still needed. And just one quick thought on the other point, one of the things, you know, there is a big shift. One of my focuses coming back to Chicago House has been to really match the geography of Chicago House with the demographics of HIV, which are clearly in communities of color and on the south and west sides of our city. But if you look at the early years of Chicago House, that was very much who we were then as well. It was under-resourced communities that still needed housing, that still, especially our families building, they were almost all single moms of color who have been living with us since the beginning of the HIV and AIDS crisis in Chicago. So very interesting how pronounced it is today, but some of those elements were in place years ago. It's just that the number of infections were affecting white gay men a lot, so they took a lot of the focus, but sometimes the most in need at the time were really still people of color who were using the services of Chicago House, oftentimes leaving their neighborhoods, coming to other parts of the city to secure housing. And I think it's time for Chicago House to do that in reverse, to leave maybe the neighborhoods we have been used to having our housing and move more directly into communities highly impacted still by new HIV infections.
I think Jason had a comment to that. And again, Jason, I apologize. I can only see half of a comment on my phone. So I don't know if you'd like to unmute and maybe.
I was just saying last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, a lot of people commented that the book we're reading right now really emphasizes the roots in kind of white Chicago in the 80s. And your comments just made me think that as a follow-on to this book, if this book club continues, maybe we could find other readings that better highlight the voices that you're just describing, the communities that are being impacted today, people of color, other marginalized communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would be really, I think that's an excellent suggestion and a really important one. So coming from a community of color myself, there are like this idea of positive status. I mean, it isn't, how do I say this? It isn't necessarily brought out into the open. It's something that quite often is kept within the closed, quiet community, and it could also be that there is from the people that I've spoken with, their backgrounds are such that they have managed the disease within their own closed community rather than going out further. But I would love to hear where, you know, the alternative viewpoint or the viewpoint coming from other communities. Sonal, I can see you giggling and I don't know why. Yeah, so sorry. So thank you for that suggestion, Jason. I think that is something that we should look into. And if there are any suggestions on the you know, sort of like the type of books that we could add to this book club, I do hope that we do keep this book club going. I'd love to hear them. Kelly, was there anything that you wanted to direct at Michael?
No, I was just going to say that I really appreciate the perspective that you shared with us, Michael, in terms of how organizations like Chicago House, Howard Brown, the AIDS Foundation, how they, in the very early years of the HIV and AIDS epidemic, how they really were so critical, provided not only critical healthcare and services, but also a space where people could come and not feel shame. And also sometimes those organizations created a sense of community, a place to live, as you said, and also a place to die. And that really struck me when you said that. Because there are people who, as we see, and even reading this book, even in the midst of people being positive, they still wanted to the extent that they could, until they couldn't move, until they were bedridden. They still wanted to be with their friends. They wanted to be at their gatherings. They wanted to be in their communities, and so they wanted to live, but then also they wanted to die. And Nabila touched me, or not that they wanted to die, they had to die, but unfortunately, some of them really did die alone, and it really hurt me to my heart when Terrence was in that in the bed, and Yale had gone into the room. He said he squeezed his thin hand, and they brought in the new year together. And Terrence said, "Yeah, I made it," you know, and then he closed his eyes and went to sleep. And then Yale left, and, you know, he wasn't able to be there until the end. And then, you know, and then like when the book talks about Nico, you know, when Nico you know, died, and Fiona was a mess, and there were, you know, some of the friends couldn't even be with Nico, you know, till the end, because Nico's family did not accept his sexual orientation. And so there was also, I mean, we talked about this before, an incredible grief of not only losing your friends, who were basically your family, to HIV and AIDS, or to AIDS, but not being able to even be with them in their last moments. And so, yeah, I mean, it really does take a village, your friends, your family, and then agencies and organizations that can advocate for you, and then provide legal services, and provide healthcare services, and hospice and housing, like that whole landscape of community advocacy and service were just so critical, and still are today. Even with, we have more rights, we have more access to opportunities overall, and so the landscape may look a little different, but there's still a need, and not all of us have been able to enjoy progress equally. So the landscape was very helpful.
Were there any questions from, this is so hard doing this on the phone. I don't know how other people do Zoom calls on a cell phone. It's a whole other story for me. Were there any other questions from?
It's a generational thing for us, Nabila.
Most of them are on the phone.
God.
I guess I have a quick, small thing to share about. Hello. Are you guys familiar with the layout of the center on Halsted next to the Whole Foods?
Yes.
At some point when I was in design school, someone from Gensler told us that the doorway from the Whole Foods to that kind of seating area was put there for the purpose of anonymity, so that if you wanted to go into the center on Halsted but not be viewed by your friends, brothers, theaters, people, that you would go through the Whole Foods and then that doorway, and then that way you'd have privacy.
What a great statement that is about, I mean, obviously Centre on Halsted, but about Whole Foods, right? I mean, I think that we have benefited. I mean, there are many things that we can be, sort of ticked off at corporations about. But at certain times and at critical junctures, I think, sort of like they do show up, and they do, sort of help in the most needed way at the time. And I think we can see that today. I'd love to throw out the question of what everyone thinks about what Shake Shack did with their stimulus package, how they've been given, I don't know how much it was, 10 million or something, and they gave it back. Now, it seems like they're incredibly solvent, and they've got a pretty extensive cash position, but I have to say that for me, it generated a great deal of goodwill towards Shake. Do you guys know about this, or have you heard about?
Yeah.
Most people had. So
can you provide a brief overview, Nabila?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that that's been stressful or distressing to a lot of people about the small business, the SBA loans, the Small Business Association, the loans that the government is giving through the SBA to small businesses. It turns out that there were reports as soon as, sort of like the program opened up, a lot of corporations went in and applied for these loans, and they got a lot of the protections, so much so that I think within the space of about 10 days, the government program had run out of money. It had all gone into different fairly large organizations and fairly large corporations. Shake Shack was one of them, and Shake Shack actually ended up getting something along the line, a stimulus package of 10 million or some such. And exactly, I was like, wait, why? First of all, why? But then when they turned around and they gave it back, I have to say I was happy to see that. I was happy to see that. I was impressed by their openness in doing it. And I put that out there, and I put it out there on social media and whatnot. And some friends did write back to me and say, well, the fact of the matter is, I don't feel particularly sorry for them. They're incredibly solvent. They have a cash basis in their business of, I don't know how many, hundreds of millions. So the 10 million wasn't even scratching the surface. But I thought it was important, and I thought it was great corporate, sort of like holding the feet to the fire of corporations in a way that we should. I know that coming out of the Corona crisis, I'm going to support the businesses and the organizations that I think did well for us, that took care of their employees, took care of their neighbors. And I just wondered what other people, had heard of, or what other people thought about that.
And while people are gathering their thoughts, I know that Eric would like to say something about that really good comment about the Central and Halstead piece. So Eric, would you like to share?
Yes. Thank you. Anastasia, I think that was a really, really interesting point that you brought up. And something that I think is interesting if we think about that, and she's right, that if you are going to Central and Halstead to get an HIV test or an HIV screening, and need to be anonymous, there's a side door that you go into, and one of the testing employees actually will go down and meet the employee and meet the individual, bring them back up, and it's a really, really interesting process. But I think what's really fascinating about this is that even today, the stigma that lives around HIV still exists, and we have to have a secret door to go. People feel like they have to do this in anonymity, and I think when we think about this book, one of the things that's so brilliant about this book is that it helps us learn and grow as a society, so that we can hopefully be informed in our future, so that organizations like Chicago House and Central and Halstead can continue advancing work and continue to try to break down the stigma that does exist around HIV and AIDS, and all of that good stuff. So I just wanted to bring that up. I thought that was a really, really interesting point. And again, think about the individual who is in the position who has to be anonymously tested, and how that person may feel in their life, the experience that they're perhaps having, which it may not, that I think we've all experienced perhaps types of isolation and loneliness and pieces like that. But the fact that that still exists today is fascinating. And I hope that people can pick up this book and learn and grow from that, so that the stigma will disappear in our lifetime.
Thank you for that, Eric. I think that that's an excellent point, because although we have come a long way, we do still need to remember that stigma is still there. It has not gone away, and and so we can't forget that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and to Nabila's great point about Whole Foods, they're a wonderful partner to organizations like Center on Halstead, and the goodwill of those corporations is critical and helps break down that stigma. So that's a really good point, Nabila.
Mm-hmm. And I think as we become, and I do think that we are becoming more informed as a citizenship and more informed as consumers. As we become more informed as consumers, we can influence these mountain corporations. I really do. And I think that going forward, we will, whatever dollars we have, we are going to make our dollars. And I think we can make our dollars work to make those corporations more responsible, because it's all well and good for us to sit back and shake a mighty fist at those individuals and at those corporations without actually going and putting some skin in the game. And I think the way to do it is, it really is, well, are you going to invest with them? Are you going to, and not that I'm a corporate hack or anything like that, trust me, but it's just something I've been thinking about, that how, when we come out of this crisis, how are we going to have changed, and how are we going to change our daily behaviors, and how are we going to hold people responsible for the things that are important to us? Where do for those that haven't gone, that are reading along, what do you think Fiona's role is in all of this? I mean, I think we are at a point, like I see, like as it started out, when Fiona in 1985-86 is a wounded bird, right? I mean, she has gone through tragedy upon tragedy, and she has watched her near and dear ones be affected by this disease. But what's happening to her in 2015? And where do you guys think her story is going?
Can I just say, in terms of where we're at in the book, she's just found out about the footage, and it's kind of like a little funny moment where Serge is like, it's not footage, it's artwork, it's not footage, it's art. And she's like, because it's so much to feel, to love so much in this impossible tragic love. So that's what I feel like she represents. It's like, I mean, love is so vast and so much, and we all experience it in so many ways, and hers is it's so intense, and it's a lot of suffering comes with her love.
I also see the inverse of the two different periods, one where people were kind of running from their families in some place and not being pursued or being kicked out, knocked out. And here is the very opposite of a mom pursuing her child, trying to reconnect. Fascinating how it's coming from the two different directions. Time periods.
Yeah, it's lovely. And I Sonal, that was a really what a great thought, that today for Serge it's art, but for Fiona it was a living, breathing tragedy. It was their lives. It wasn't, and maybe that is why they say that time is such a healer, right? That it takes the most, like when you think of how Nico passes, or how Terence passes, how all of those people passed, it was awful. I mean, it wasn't one of these, you know, sort of like they died of consumption and it was a, you know, a fainting couch. It was nasty, ugly, bloody, painful. And here it is this much later on in 2015, and it's art. And you're seeing I think it's fascinating. And I know I said this last week, but I am so happy that Richard, with all of his promiscuity and with all of his, you know, sort of voyeurism and with all of his, you know, sort of like just that he lived through it, and that he was able to chronicle it in a way that perhaps somebody who had walked into the liberated era of the 80s, because for him it was liberated, because he came from the 60s and the 70s where he was hidden and closeted. And we haven't even gotten to Bill. Actually, we should come, after this point, we should come back to Bill. Hidden and closeted and all of the shame that was involved in like the 60s and the 70s, you know, sort of around being gay. And then he comes into the 80s and it's freedom. It was you know, sort of like a fantastically open time until wham, this disease hits and essentially pushes people back into the closet. And I love the fact that he is able to traverse those three periods: the period before, the period during, and then actually the period after that initial crisis. And I love that he survived.
Yes, survived. He not only, and in addition to surviving, he thrived. And to me, that's important too, because in addition to, you know, the LGBTQ communities, in particular gay men at that time in the 80s and 90s being so hit hard by HIV and AIDS, there was stigma and notions of being in the closet and surviving or death. It's also important to remember that there were people who not only survived illness, but who also thrived. They did go on to develop careers. They went on to create families in whatever ways they wanted to create families. They created art. They went through all of the ups and downs in life that other people go through. And so I think for Richard, he serves as that as well as in a way Fiona. You know, Fiona is also someone who, you know, she continued living her life. She had a child. She was married. She, you know, got divorced, and, you know, and her daughter gets wrapped up with this guy, and they go off into some cult or something like that together. And here it is, 2015, and she's living too. And she has lived and is continuing to live a very full, complicated life. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
This is Teresa. Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Yes.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I want to make a comment about Fiona being a mother, because I think there was, you know, that conflict that she had with her parents not accepting Nico. And the idea that her daughter does get involved with a cult. I think, you know, there's families, parents who think that when their child is LGBT, that it's some sort of group that is kind of, they're being influenced by, and they're being taken into and being brainwashed in a way. And I saw that comparison with that idea of her daughter. She's looking for her daughter, but in a sense, she has hope for her daughter. Kind of like what Michael's comment is, people were throwing their kids out when they were gay, and they still do, but, you know, more so in the 80s. But now she's looking for her child. But it's that idea that something's influencing her and trying to take her away. And I believe there are families who think that about when your child is gay, that they're being influenced to be gay.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
That's a great point. That is a great point. And that's how my mom felt initially. You know, I realized I was gay when I was at Wellesley College, and she was convinced it was because I was around all of these, you know, these Wellesley lesbians who, you know, took me under their wing and, you know, converted me, which was true. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, that's how she was thinking, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. There are still people that think that it's a life choice, or that it's a choice as opposed to it's biology. It's your nature, right? Yeah, I find that interesting. That brings me to I don't know what everybody's watching these days, but has anyone been watching Mrs. America?
No. What is it about?
Boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Okay, so for anyone interested in the women's movement and how the women's movement ties to gay rights, you must watch Mrs. America. It's on Hulu. I'm sure it'll come across some other platforms sooner or later as well. But it is a mini-series starring Kate Blanchett, who plays Schlafly. What was her first name? Why am I blanking on Schlafly's
Phyllis.
first name? Phyllis. Thank you, Phyllis Schlafly. She plays Phyllis Schlafly. Tracy Ullman plays Betty Frieden, sorry, not Man, Frieden. And I cannot remember the name of the actress who plays Gloria Steinem, but so it all revolves around the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, and how Phyllis Schlafly went and essentially quashed the Equal Rights Amendment. And throughout it, and with all of these debates, it's Schlafly, and I knew this, but I hadn't dug into it as much as when I started watching this show. But it was Schlafly that then makes the comparison. She is dead set against the Equal Rights Amendment, dead set against it. And all of these other female luminaries of their age, and frankly of our age even, sort of like are up against her. And this woman just goes out by just sheer will of force and ends up ruining the Equal Rights Amendment, but also making that link to same-sex marriage and unisex bathrooms. Now, we're talking 1973. We're talking 1972, the election back then. Then we are talking, so after the election, Roe versus Wade. So the second episode is all about Roe versus Wade. And then you go into, from Roe versus Wade, they extrapolate into the gay rights movement. And it's brilliant. And it is very, very well worth watching for a book club like this. So I highly recommend it. It's called Mrs. America. It's brilliant. But is there somebody, Teresa, were you involved with any of the work that was done on the unisex bathrooms bills that went around the country 2 years ago, a couple of years ago? Could you talk a little about that, or was that?
I was involved with it, but I wouldn't say at the extent of some of the, the main players in it. I had at the time worked I'm a consultant for the Chicago Children's Museum, and one of the things that had happened there was it was one of the first public institutions, which happened to be a children's environment, to put up a genderless bathroom sign so it could welcome its visitors. So in that sense, I consulted with the museum and also just worked with some of the players who were involved with putting the bill forth on that end, just to help out on that, but not nearly as much as I probably Kelly can speak to it. I don't. Were you involved with CRAP? I was for Pride Action Tank.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I, in my capacity with the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, which is the city's civil rights department, we worked with the Chicago Restroom Access Project, otherwise known as CRAP. And CRAP is this collective of people who are advocates, people who work in academic institutions, nonprofits, government agencies, tech, all kinds of folks. And they wanted to address these really horrendous bathroom bills and a lot of stigma and shame that people who are gender nonconforming or gender expansive or people who are transgender, particularly transgender women, experience when they access restrooms. And in Chicago, our very own city, when the Human Rights Ordinance added gender identity to as a protected class, I think there was, if I recall correctly, there was a stipulation around that said, okay, if this is going to be an added class, a protected class, gender identity, then there has to be, then there's something in there. People who are against that petitioned and said, then we want a clause in the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance that conditions access to restrooms, locker rooms, or other spaces that are private in nature upon presenting an ID. And how the person presents needs to match the sex that's listed on the ID. And so it did create a loophole for people who are trans or who, quote unquote, don't look like a male or female. It created, some problems. And so thanks to a lot of the advocacy and education work and promotion and all of that of CRAP, the CRAP Collective, along with the Chicago Human Rights Ordinances, aldermen who were very involved. So Alderman Pat Dowell at the time, who headed the City Council's Human Relations Committee, and other folks who were advocates and who really supported, we were able to get that nasty provision removed from the Chicago Human Rights Ordinance. So that's an example, a local example of work that was being done that was a real collaboration between nonprofit activists and government to address this.
Yeah, it's that was an amazing piece of advocacy locally, and just watching this show and like the light bulbs going off or the flares going off of, oh my days, this is how the right, and it was the right, how they threaded from and it all goes from sort of like the ERA, then to Roe versus Wade, then stepwise into sort of like into each of our rights. So I highly recommend it. Devon, can you keep us honest on the time, because again, I don't have a clock or anything here and I don't know what time it is.
It's 6:28.
Okay. So were there any other comments from today's reading, what you would like to hear for next week, or sort of like any other direction that you guys would like us to take this?
Yeah.
A quick comment I wanted to say is that when you were talking about like Richard and like the archive and the exhibit and stuff, it made me see what he had in common with Nora, and she was like the Richard of her day.
Oh yeah.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Absolutely. Wow.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I love that because Nora, God, what a character, and what a time she lived through. But yeah, I guess that's right.
It sounds like she'd be a hoot to go to have dinner and drinks with. Can you imagine?
Oh, God. Yeah. It'd be amazing.
Yeah, her and Yale would gossip all night.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think, Kelly, I think we almost are at the time where we need to wrap up for this week.
We
And
are.
I think Devon's going to tell us one of you is going to tell us which pages we're reading for this coming week.
Yes. So our next session is next Thursday, April 30th. We're reading pages 161 to 216. Again, 161 to 216. And we're so excited. The theme for next week's conversation will be race and HIV. And our conversation partner will be Aisha Davis. Aisha Davis is Policy Director at the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. She also happens to be a friend of mine. So it's a real treat that she's actually going to be joining a dynamic person. And so I'm really excited that she'll be joining us for next Thursday's discussion. You're muted. You're on mute.
I told you, technology neutral at best and useless at probably worst. So I think thank you all very much. That was somebody coming to fix the doohickey that needs to get me back up and running. Thank you all for joining us again this week, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, because it's an hour that I really, really look forward to.
You're doing great, Bia.
Thanks, Betty.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jason.
Hey, if you guys, there's a documentary that just came out on Netflix too called Circus of Books, which I just watched last night. It's kind of goes along with this. It's about a straight couple that owns a porn shop in West Hollywood, and it goes through a lot of the stuff that this book's taught.
Oh, brilliant.
So if you're looking for a little history, it's a good one to catch.
Excellent. Thanks. I'm gonna check that out, and I'll report back next week.
That's a great recommendation. Thank you for that. We have that, and we have Mrs. America, the documentary on Hulu. So we want to thank Michael from Chicago House again, President and CEO of Chicago House. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your reflections, and also bravo to all the great work that you and your team at Chicago House are doing.
Thank you so much, guys.
Yep. All right. Talk to you guys soon.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.